All right, so today we're diving into something kind of spicy. How do we keep that spark alive in long-term relationships? You know, that heart-racing feeling, the one that tends to fade. Well, thankfully, someone sent over Mating in Captivity by Esther Perel. And let me tell you, this book is like a backstage pass to all the complexities of desire.
I know. It's so fascinating how Pearl uses real stories, from her actual practice as a couples therapist to dissect why those flames fizzle out. And she doesn't hold back.
No, she does not.
Things get pretty steamy.
They do. So let's get right into it. Our mission today is to unpack these mysteries of modern love and sex. Why does that desire fade? More importantly, how do we figure out those two basic needs? That craving for stability and security, but also wanting excitement and passion.
Exactly. Perel starts off by talking about this paradox of modern love. And when you think about it, we expect our partners to be everything. Our best friend, our confidant, co-parent, and our ultimate lover.
Yeah, it's a big ask.
Right.
Too much.
It's a lot to ask of one person.
It is.
And Perel argues that this is where things get messy. We end up merging so completely with our partner that we lose that otherness, which is actually super important for eroticism.
It's interesting because I could see that, encouraging your partner's individual things, their passions, their own interests.
Yeah.
Could actually strengthen the connection.
Totally, because it's that separateness, that sense of them having their own life outside of you, that can reignite the flame.
So Perel's basically saying, clinging too tightly can suffocate the relationship. She uses this example of Charles and Rose, who have been married for 40 years. And get this, their desire is reignited when Charles, starts showing interest in other women.
It seems counterintuitive, but it makes sense. Rose suddenly sees Charles as a bit more mysterious, less predictable. He's not just her husband anymore. He's an individual with his own desires.
So she's reminded of his desirability, the fact that he could choose someone else.
Exactly. It highlights how important it is to maintain that individuality within a relationship. If we lose ourselves in the we, there's no I left to be attracted to.
Have you ever felt like you've lost yourself in a relationship? Perel would say. You need to reclaim that sense of me, to keep that spark alive. And if we're talking about losing ourselves, we have to talk about communication. We're always told that open communication is key to a healthy relationship. But then Perel throws in this tyranny of talk.
Yes, and it's as if we think talking about our problems will fix everything, even when it comes to sex. We focus so much on words, and we neglect that language of the body, the nonverbal ways we connect.
And Perel says, we naively believe that the essence of who we are is most accurately conveyed through words.
Right.
Such a good quote.
It is, and this overemphasis on verbal communication can be hard on men, who are sometimes, let's be honest, less comfortable expressing their emotions verbally. And at the same time, it can also repress women's sexuality, which often thrives on feelings and sensations, more than just words.
She talks about Mitch and Laura, who are constantly fighting, blaming each other for their dead bedroom. But their issue is that they can't connect physically.
Their struggle to be physically intimate shows how uncomfortable we are as a society with nonverbal intimacy. We're so focused on talking it out that we forget about touch, eye contact, or just being present together.
We've lost the language of desire. And Perel links this back to the conflicting messages we get about sex, that legacy of Puritanism, with its emphasis on shame and repression. But on the other hand, we have this modern obsession with hedonism, this idea that sex should be mind-blowing all the time.
So we've got this clash of sex is dirty, but also sex should be amazing, and it leaves couples feeling confused.
Totally. How can you not be disappointed in the bedroom? With those messages, Perel talks about Maria, who was raised Catholic, with these strict views on sex. And she's struggling to reconcile those beliefs with her desire for a fulfilling sex life with her husband.
Maria's story is so interesting because it shows how cultural and personal histories shape our erotic blueprints, those unconscious patterns and expectations that we bring to our relationships.
It makes you think about your own upbringing, your own experiences with love and sex. How are those influencing your current relationship?
Exactly.
So we've got these cultural messages, our personal histories, and then throw in something major like kids, and desire just disappears. Perel calls parenthood a minor cataclysm for a couple's sex life.
And it's true. Becoming a parent often leads to less desire, especially for women. There are the biological factors, of course, like hormones, but also the cultural expectations on mothers.
That pressure to be the perfect parent, always putting the child first.
Yes. And that focus on practicality and control can really stifle spontaneity and desire.
Perel shares two very different stories. We have Stephanie, who finds motherhood totally draining, even sexually. Then there's Amber, who
Yeah.
actually finds this new sexual confidence after having kids.
And Perel isn't saying there's a right way to experience motherhood, just that there's no one solution to navigating how kids impact a couple's sex life.
But she does encourage couples
Yeah.
to be intentional about making space for their relationship, even with all the chaos of being a parent, to prioritize intimacy and connection,
Right.
which is easier said than done.
Way easier said than done.
Right.
Yes.
So how do we navigate fidelity then in this age of so many options? And instant gratification.
Right.
Good question.
It is. And this is where Perel's work gets really interesting. She argues that our obsession with finding the one sets us up for failure. It makes infidelity almost inevitable.
Yeah, we're always told that we need to find that one perfect person to fulfill all our needs.
So much pressure.
It is.
And like Perel says, it often leads to disappointment. No single person can be everything to us.
She says that a lot of affairs aren't actually about being unhappy in the marriage, but wanting something more, like novelty excitement, a feeling of being alive.
Yeah, that's missing from the day-to-day
Exactly.
of a long-term relationship.
She talks about Doug, a man who has an affair, even though he's content in his marriage. It's not that he wants to leave his wife.
Yeah.
He just wants something more that he feels is missing.
That's so interesting.
And then she challenges this idea
Yeah.
that monogamy is the only type of fidelity,
She does.
which blew my mind.
It's interesting. She explores
Different approaches to fidelity.
from strict monogamy to open relationships, recognizing that there's no single right answer. When it comes to fidelity, the important thing is that couples talk openly and honestly about their needs, their desires, and boundaries.
This all comes back to self-awareness,
Right.
knowing ourselves and what we want and need in a relationship.
Yes, and this leads us to one of Perel's most interesting concepts, the erotic blueprint.
Okay, tell me more.
This is where it gets personal. She argues that our early experiences, especially in our families, really shape our beliefs and anxieties about intimacy and desire, and those anxieties play out in our adult relationships.
So we're carrying these invisible scripts that tell us how to approach love and sex.
And Perel says that becoming aware of those scripts can be super insightful. It helps us make sense of our desires, our challenges, and even those irrational reactions we have.
She uses the story of James to show this. James feels a lot of guilt about his mother's unhappiness during his childhood.
Yeah.
And that guilt shows up as a sexual inhibition with his wife.
Wow.
It's like he's sabotaging his own happiness because he associates pleasure with guilt.
It's powerful stuff. And this is where Perel's work as a therapist comes in. She helps people like James unpack those blueprints to understand where they come from and to start rewriting them. It's about breaking free from the past and creating new possibilities for intimacy and desire in the present.
So we've explored these challenges, cultural influences, and even the psychological baggage we bring to our relationships. But the big question is, how do we bring back that spark? How do we reignite desire in a long-term relationship?
That's what we'll dive into next. But remember, it's not about fixing a problem. It's about creating a more playful, more intentional approach to eroticism.
I like that.
Yeah.
Playful and intentional.
It's a good way to think about it.
It is.
So, welcome back to our deep dive into Esther Perel's Mating in Captivity. We've explored the challenges of keeping that desire alive in long-term relationships. But now, let's get practical. What can we actually do to bring back that spark?
Okay, yes, please. We've covered a lot.
Yeah.
I'm ready for some actionable advice. Where do we begin?
Well, Perel gives us a bunch of strategies, but they all come back to this one idea. We need to change how we think about sex and relationships. It's not about fixing a problem. It's about making a more playful, intentional approach to eroticism.
So instead of waiting for desire to just show up, we have to create space for it, like tending a garden.
I love that analogy. Desire needs the right conditions to grow. And Perel talks about this idea of embracing paradox, finding that balance between separateness and connection, security and adventure.
Yeah, that makes sense. We need that solid foundation of trust and stability. But we also crave excitement and novelty. It's like this push and pull between wanting to merge with our partner, but also keeping our own identity.
Exactly. And that goes back to what we talked about with encouraging our partner's individuality, recognizing that our relationship isn't the end. It's the starting point for growth, both individually and as a couple.
This is making me think about conflict. Like if we always avoid conflict in a relationship, trying to just keep things smooth, are we actually preventing growth?
That's such a good point. Perel actually talks about how healthy conflict can actually bring energy and eroticism to a relationship. It's about learning to fight fair, to say what we need and want without attacking our partner.
Okay, but back to the practical tips. Remember how we talked about scheduling sex? It still feels weird to me, like scheduling a dentist appointment. Does that actually work?
It does for some people, but others really hate the idea, and that's fine. It's about figuring out what works for you and your partner. But the key here is being intentional. Like, think about it. When you were dating, you put in the effort. Planned dates created anticipation. Why should that stop? Just because you're in a relationship.
I see your point. It's about making that effort for intimacy. And I love how Perel talks about bringing back playfulness and excitement that we had at the beginning of the relationship.
Exactly. And that could be scheduling sex, but it could also be trying new things or even just making time for each other's passions. Remember, otherness.
Right. Giving each other space to grow. But how do we cultivate that otherness without having an affair?
That's the question, isn't it? It goes back to that balance of we and me.
Yeah.
It's about supporting our partners to follow their own interests, their own friendships, even if we aren't involved. It's like having two plants in one pot. They need their own space to grow strong, and that actually makes the whole thing more beautiful.
I love that visual. It goes against what we're told, that we should be everything to our partner.
And that's just not possible. It puts so much pressure on one person, and it can really suffocate the relationship. So instead of holding on so tight, we need to give each other space to breathe, to grow, to become more ourselves, and that, ironically, makes us more attractive to our partner.
Okay, so scheduling sex, encouraging individual pursuits. What about fantasy? Perel talks a lot about embracing fantasy in long-term relationships. I have to admit, I get a little hesitant with that one, like sharing all my fantasies. Feels a bit too revealing.
I totally get it. And Perel says that not all fantasies are meant to be acted out. Sometimes the fantasy itself is enough to spark desire, to add some spice to the relationship.
So it's more about using our imagination to break out of that routine, to tap into those desires that might be hidden.
Yes.
Okay.
And sharing those fantasies with our partner, even if you don't act on them, can create so much intimacy. It builds vulnerability and trust, a deeper understanding of each other.
This is all so interesting. But what do you think is the most important takeaway from Perel's work? What's the one thing you wish all couples understood about keeping desire alive?
That's a great question. For me, it's this. Desire isn't something you find, it's something you create. We can choose to cultivate eroticism in our relationships, but it takes effort and being intentional and a willingness to challenge what we think love and sex should look like.
That's a powerful thought. We're not just victims of biology or whatever. We have the power to choose and make decisions that bring more passion and joy into our relationships.
Yes.
I love that.
And it starts with changing our mindset. We need to embrace the paradoxical nature of desire, recognizing that it needs both security and adventure, separateness and connection.
So it's not about finding the one perfect person. It's about creating the perfect relationship, one that allows for growth and change, and even conflict.
Right, because like Perel says, conflict isn't always bad. It can help us grow, understand each other better, and even reignite desire. When we clash with our partner, it's often because we care. It means we're still invested in the relationship.
So it's about learning to fight fair, to see conflict as a way to get closer, not tear us apart.
Exactly.
And maybe even bring back some passion.
Exactly. It's about seeing relationships as a dance, a constant back and forth between closeness and distance, harmony and tension, and finding that sweet spot, that balance, is what makes it exciting.
This deep dive has been amazing. I'm seeing my own relationship differently now. But I keep thinking, we've talked about taking responsibility, we've talked about communication, but what about the role of culture? It feels like we're going against all these messages about what love and sex are supposed to be.
You're right. We don't exist in a bubble. Our ideas about relationships are shaped by the world around us, by what we've learned since we were kids.
We mentioned those mixed messages about sex, Puritanism versus hedonism, and then there's this whole finding the one thing. That pressure to find the perfect person.
And Perel wants us to question those ideas, to think about how these cultural norms might actually be limiting us.
So it's not just our own baggage. We're fighting against years of societal conditioning.
In a way, yes. But the good news is, these norms are always changing. We can choose which ones to follow and which ones to challenge.
Like the whole finding the one thing. Perel says we should focus on creating the perfect relationship. Not finding the perfect person, a relationship that lets both people grow and change.
Exactly.
And have healthy conflict.
Because remember, conflict can be a good thing.
Right.
It's about recognizing that relationships are always moving. They're a mix of closeness and distance, harmony and tension. And finding that balance is what keeps things interesting.
Okay, so we've talked about the challenges of modern love, the power of those erotic blueprints, some practical tips for bringing back the spark. But there's one more thing. We need to talk about communication. How do we talk honestly and openly with our partner about sex and desire?
That's what we'll get into next, because those conversations can be tough. There's that fear of rejection, fear of hurting our partner, even the fear of finding out something we don't want to know. But Perel gives us some great advice on how to navigate those conversations with compassion and clarity.
We're back and ready to tackle the communication piece of all this. We've talked about so much from mating and captivity, all these fascinating ideas. But if we can't communicate with our partners, it's just a bunch of ideas. No real change.
That's so true. And this is where Perel's background as a therapist really helps. She gets how hard it is to be honest about sex and desire, especially in long-term relationships.
Yeah, these aren't exactly easy conversations. We're scared of hurting our partner's feelings, or being rejected, or even finding out something we didn't want to know.
There's a lot of vulnerability there. That's why Perel talks about making a safe space for these conversations, approaching them with curiosity and compassion, really listening without judgment. It's not about blaming anyone. It's about exploring together what you both need and want.
So how do we actually do that? Like, are there any specific techniques to make these conversations less awkward?
Perel suggests using I statements, focusing on your own feelings and needs, not blaming your partner. So instead of saying, "You never initiate sex," you could say, "I feel really loved and desired when you make the first move sometimes." It changes things. From blame to longing, from complaint to invitation.
And being specific too, right? Not just saying, "I wish we were more intimate," but something like, "I would love it if we cuddled more."
Exactly. Give your partner a clear picture. Let them know what you want, and Perel knows these conversations might be awkward at first. But like anything, the more you practice, the easier it gets. It's about showing up for each other, even when it's hard. Because that vulnerability is the basis for intimacy.
This whole deep dive has been eye-opening. I'm seeing my own relationship differently. But I keep thinking about this. We've talked about responsibility, communication, but what about the role of culture in all this? It feels like we're swimming upstream against all these messages about what love and sex should be.
That's such an important point. We're not in a vacuum. The culture we live in shapes us. The messages we've heard since childhood.
Right. We talked about those mixed messages about sex, Puritanism and hedonism, and this whole finding the one idea, that pressure to find the perfect person.
And Perel says, we need to question those ideas. Think about how those cultural norms might be holding us back.
So it's not just our own baggage. We're fighting against generations of conditioning.
Yeah, kind of. But the good thing is, these norms change. We get to choose which ones to follow and which ones to challenge.
Like finding the one. Perel says to focus on creating the perfect relationship, not finding the perfect person. A relationship that lets both people grow and change.
And have healthy conflict.
Right.
Because conflict can actually be good.
It can.
It's about seeing relationships as always changing, a mix of closeness and distance, harmony and tension, and finding that balance keeps things interesting.
This deep dive has been a journey. We've covered the challenges, the psychology, practical tips, and even the role of culture. But as we wrap up, I have one last question for you.
Yeah.
For our listeners.
I love a good ending question.
What if keeping that spark alive isn't about finding the perfect person, but about creating space for ourselves and your partners to change and surprise each other? What if it's about embracing the messiness, the unpredictability, the journey of intimacy? What if it's about choosing again and again to be present and let love and desire unfold in their own way?
That's a beautiful thought. It reminds us that relationships aren't destinations. They're journeys with twists and turns, highs and lows. And within that journey, there's always that potential to find desire again, to reignite the spark, to create a love that lasts and is truly fulfilling.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into mating in captivity. We hope you leave feeling inspired, empowered, and maybe even a little more in love with the beautiful messiness of human connection.
And until next time, keep those conversations going, those boundaries clear, and those sparks flying.